Thank you, Raja. As always, with Raja's talk, a lot on the table. So what I'll do is I invite questions. Can you just identify yourself, keep your questions as brief as possible so we can have as many people participate in the discussion. So the floor is open. Rahul first. Raja, can we take 3 questions? We take Rahul and then JT.
Rahul Mukherjee from ISAS and the Salvation Studies program. I want to push you a little bit on a number of issues. The issue number one is, for example, let's just take the economy, because you think that the domestic basis of foreign policy is important, right? And I'm not even comparing Vajpayee with Narasimha Rao, Modi with Narasimha Rao. We can do that as well. But let's just compare Modi with Vajpayee, the difference. What you said is more true of Vajpayee than of Modi, which is that he will be restrained by the RSS. Vajpayee wanted an RSS finance minister and had to tolerate an RSS finance minister, which was Yashwant Sinha, and had to actually keep Jaswant Singh out for a very long time. And we know that these debates played out at that time, and it was only after Vajpayee was able to get on top of the RSS that Jaswant Singh was made finance minister. And because Sundar has asked me to be brief, I'm not going to push you on many issues, but I think this is an iconic way to get into some of the arguments that you're making. In the current ministerial portfolio and the cabinet, you have a different kind of predicament. It is not that Modi wants a minister and he doesn't get it. It is that he has a minister who doesn't know anything about finance. He tolerates a Reserve Bank governor who is from the previous regime, very smart. He gets a principal secretary who probably wasn't expecting to become one, but is very smart. He gets, after a lot of debate and cogitation, an economic advisor who has criticized him. But at the end of the day, it seems to be not so much a predicament of the Swadeshi band as it is the predicament of what happens when you become the repository of all knowledge in the absence of contestation. So, for example, one can argue what India was when Patel and Nehru were alive, and economic policy was, and what happened after Nehru became the prima donna. Narasimha Rao also functioned in that way. To me, the real question is, would you bat for the proposition that the pendulum swung so much from debate, cogitation, argumentation, and contestation towards such a decisiveness that will produce all manner of results? Because you want investments, but you have to improve regulation. We don't see anything over there. You're talking about engagement, but you haven't done anything significant. So, is a single man with all power going to produce the kinds of results that you're talking about? Yeah, that's my question.
That's right.
Should I? Yeah, my query is very different from what Rahul said. It's just a query. I'm thinking in terms of India-Singapore relations, where Singapore has almost become a kind of a reference point for many things. So I'm just going by what you said, that this is not a complete detour. Detraction from the earlier laid out foreign policies, but there's a new kind of thinking in that, element of thinking. So how do you think, and where is Singapore, where does Singapore figure in the Indian foreign policy, Modi's Indian foreign policy? Does it come with a new kind of thinking? Is there trajectory which is laid out in so many clear terms?
Thank you.
Quick follow-up question on the RSS. Pratap Bhanumehta was here a couple of years ago. He was making the point in response to some questions that the RSS too has changed. It's not sort of the RSS of the 90s, 2000s. It's evolved in different ways. But I have a question on, you were talking about the internal tensions, sort of the political situation, so the electoral cycle keeps it's endless, so there are elections, state election all the time. And the RSS, in many ways, I think from the last election, not only the heartland, but in southern and eastern states, are really, in terms of organization, the foot soldiers of the BJP. So in that sense, do you think, will Modi be able to overcome the organizational muscle in the RSS lens by directly reaching out, as I was saying, to the middle class, the youth, the constituents of the BJP actively engaged? So that tension, do you think he will be able to, or is he willing to overcome? Can he allow it?
Rajan, you take these three questions.
No, I think on Rahul's important question, my answer is, look, I don't know at this point. What you do know is, look, this guy is strong and he's not going to prematurely pick a fight with the RSS. I mean, we can debate for a long time whether relative positions of Vajpayee and this man. I think both have a problem in terms of that is in the nature of the relationship between the BJP and the RSS. What we do know is that, look, he's marginalized the old guard. He's compelled the party and the RSS to do something they never did before, to nominate a prime ministerial candidate before. That he's announced a broad agenda of reform. I mean, not very much, but liberalization of the FDI. Luckily for him, the international oil prices gave him a chance to do some accommodation on the subsidies in relation to. So, and he's continued some of the older initiatives. But I think the tussle remains, and I think one way of resolving it, I think, is to throw a few bones that you can't always defeat the tiger. You throw them the HRD ministry, shall we say. You throw them the culture warrior nonsense and say, look, okay, you want to oppose, Sanskrit, you want to bring in Sanskrit, you want to do all this nonsense, fine. I mean, okay, you don't. But sometimes, like for example, on the genetic GM seeds, you have to give in a little bit when these guys came. But I think, I don't think he's there to pursue RSS agenda. I think he has his own ambition, his own ideas. That fundamentally is one of the few guys who's actually wanted the job, prepared for it, and got it. Barring Nehru, all the others were probably thrust into this. That this guy, first time, senses that, look, he has a moment here and that he's going to do it. How he does it is the story. I mean, I don't think the outcomes are predetermined. Like, who would have thought this guy can take on the Shiv Sena and do what he did to them? So I think there is a boldness in terms of the political conception, but he also has to be careful in navigating because you've seen the tension, for example, when he said Amit Shah is the captain who won the game. You had next day, so that Bhagwat says, no, these guys think they won the election, which comes back to your point. So I think the tension between them, how that gets resolved, I mean, that is going to be the big political story. Is he going to accommodate the core ideology of the RSS, whether it's in relation to Hindutva, where he says, look, let's have a moratorium for 10 years in an August 15 speech. No, they're not fully responded to that on some issues. You take them on, you saw love jihad being played out in UP, but okay, pulled out in Maharashtra and Haryana. So I think he has to find a way to modernize the RSS as well. But given its organizational structure, who is going to prevail, how, I think that's why I think the membership drive issue is going to be very interesting. If you can expand the membership, which is going to be drawn on his merit, his attraction, then I think you might see interesting. But I think the battle is not over. How we characterize it, we can differ, but I think that's not over. But how that gets played out is going to be an important element. I think on the communalism issue, I mean, he's not said one wrong word, but he's also not reined in the crazies. I mean, when they say things, he's not been pulling them back. So I think that struggle will have to go on, and how that gets resolved, of course, is going to be an important part of India's transition, where the BJP can actually become a pan-national party. Like, look, you have the finance, you have the Home Minister and the Foreign Minister, both are Hindi fanatics. One is a socialist tradition, so North Indian socialists can't get over Hindi. The RSS can't get over Hindi and Hindu, the mix up between the two. Now, if you're trying to win, in Bengal and Tamil Nadu and Odisha and Andhra, if that is your long-term goal, you don't go around throwing Hindi on, thrusting it down the people's But he can't change everyone overnight. So that's where I think, is it a strong man? How much can he change? We don't know. I mean, I think we've seen Deng Xiaoping do that in a system where he had full control, and a system that had gone through the ravages of cultural revolution for 15 years. So here he has to play this in an Indian style with all the constraints, and that what he has done so far is interesting, but is not decisive. So I think those battles will play out. In terms of Singapore, that look, everybody loves Singapore and India. I mean, the problem has not been lack of an understanding of what Singapore and ASEAN will play, but the problem has been our domestic capacity to enforce anything. So if he changes that, I mean, you don't need to come and tell Singapore, look, you have a special role in my foreign policy. If you change, actually, if you say project implementation improves, if your industrial environment, regulatory environment improves, people are going to come on their own. So I don't think we have any problem there. The problem is what Rahul said, look, how far can you go domestically to transform the way you operate? If we do that, I think this is a natural sphere of India's interest, and there's goodwill for India. The problem has been, how do you take advantage of that?
Second round of questions, Dr. Chaudhary first.
Thank you, Professor Rajamohan. As you are aware, I've always sort of heard you and listened even before we had actually physically met. And having been someone who's had a long experience or interest in not just implementing, but I'd like to think shaping of how a major South Asian country reacts to India, I take everything that you say very seriously. One or 2 points. In May this year, we all had a sense on the fringes of India that there was a sense of hope over experience. I mean, we've had a long experience with India, and then hope on the 27th of May. Eventually, now 6 months gone, we see that no major issue in South Asia has been not only successfully addressed, but attempts have been made to seriously address them. The 2 countries that you spoke of course, Nepal and Bhutan, we tend to think that somehow Nepal and Bhutan now follow a policy towards India, something like a pilot fish behavior. You tack closer to the shark in order to avoid being eaten. But the 3 key countries remain Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. There is a sinking of the fact that there is no fundamental change. Not just that the emperor has no clothes, but there is no fundamental change. Eventually, the old received wisdom that the traditional establishment in the foreign policy system, which is the South Bloc, and to a certain extent the Ministry of Commerce and Defense, will prevail. The old system will prevail. They are just allowing the old man to go out and make some rhetorical statements.
Young man compared to the previous.
By old man, I mean not his
Big
age,
man.
but the big man.
Yeah.
Big man, just as the Pakistan army did with Nawaz Sharif initially. Allow him to go out and say these things, do things, but hold on to your own fort. So, is this, do you think that this could be so, or do you think the best policy for these neighboring governments would be to sort of have faith in God, but keep your powder dry?
Amit first, then Surya. Amit?
Raja, as usual, very enlightening talk, and I wanted to come back to the very first point that you made, where diplomacy is being increasingly engineered in a manner that would serve the broader national economic objectives. And though it's still too early, but I just wanted to have your thoughts on this. That do you see this fundamental conviction that he has would make Modi move towards a direction where he introduces structural changes of a kind, where you actually get to see a very different kind of Indian foreign service, where there's a lot more of commercial expertise. And what we actually get to see within the Indian structure is more of a convergence between diplomatic and trade expertise like you get to see in countries like Australia or Canada. Do you see that to be a possibility under Modi?
Surya?
Yes, it nuclear deal with the US, do you think it's heading towards becoming a closed chapter in the sense that nothing may happen on that front? Or do you think that if India is more accommodative towards the US on trade and climate change issues, the multilateral ones, do you think there is a possibility of the US being more accommodative of India on the civil nuclear deal? Thank you.
I think good questions. I mean, I would say, look, I think you hope or experience, as you said, look, if you can be realist and say, look, what are the structural limitations? You can also be constructivist and say, look, here is ideas matter and ideas producing. I think Sindhu will say more about it, that you can actually, new ideas can shape the way you deal with the neighborhood. My sense is both are at play, I would say, for change. Look, you can always say, look, nothing is going to change. But things have changed compared to where we were before 91 in terms of, there was a difference between Indira Gandhi's policy to neighborhood and Gujarat's policy, because Gujarat did not have the power to enforce very much. You've seen Manmohan Singh do some things incrementally, market access to the neighboring countries, I mean, to Bangladesh in particular, that has changed. You've actually negotiated a boundary agreement, but you couldn't run the last mile. So it's to say nothing has changed, I think, would be empirically not true. But you can be right, you can be skeptical saying, look, I want to see more, and I have not seen the real big step. So one Nepal and Bhutan are easy, as I said, they're different. You might call them protectorates or subalterns, whatever it is. But I don't think that's the sense you get if you go to Nepal, where they're pretty, you had Prachanda running after the Chinese and saying, look, we're going to play the China card. So I think nobody wants to be subordinate. So I think everyone has room to play. That's what I tell my Indian friends, look, don't talk too much about strategic autonomy. That's exactly what Sri Lanka is trying to do to you. That's exactly what Nepal wants to do to you. That's exactly what Bhutan is also wanting to do to you. So I don't see states would want to maximize their leverage, but if you have a big neighbor, you want to make sure you got somebody else. So just as India does non-alignment, our neighbors do it as well. And I think our problem is intellectually we're struggling to come to terms with it in India. But I think if we do the land boundary agreement, I would say that is a decisive step. Where you have to go to Parliament and make the case, look, even if I lose 10,000 acres, this is a big deal. This is a new way of dealing with our neighbors. So on the economic side, it's relatively easy, where I think he can do, let's see what he says in Kathmandu next week. That on the economic side, as Indian economy grows, you can give a lot more openings to your market, make your neighbors feel they have a share in your growth. So that is strategically sensible as well, that in the long term, how do you integrate the region? That's the difference between Gujral, who thought of saying nice things to the neighbors. He was a socialist, peacenik. But this guy is a capitalist who's saying, look, integration is a great idea. So I think, can he pursue that? How far? I would say jury is out. I'm not saying, but I think it's different. I would say, just caution you not to underestimate the prospects of change. But I think, as I said myself, in Bengal and Assam, there's deep opposition from the party itself. So can you overcome? I think that's why I said that's going to be a big test. Second, with Sri Lanka, you got to play now. For the first time, there is a prime minister who's not obliged to support from Tamil parties, right? Like you had Mr. Manmohan Singh could not even travel to Colombo for a multilateral summit because of posturing in Chennai. But this guy gets, what's that guy's name? Rajapaksa, for the swearing in. Jayalalitha said, look, our dead body, said, so be it. Okay, nothing happened. So if you have a strong government, then it has options. But then they're also trying to expand in Tamil Nadu, so how far can they play? So I think how you deal with Sri Lanka, of how do you get a deal on the Tamil question that would give you room to play the larger game. So I think that's the test. That test awaits, and so let's see what happens. There are many things you need to do. If you think Mr. Rajapaksa is going to play the China card too much at some point, different ideas, regime change, there's a whole lot of things that could happen, did happen, probably. So I think that doesn't mean this guy is going to sit back and say, I'm Manmohan Singh, I won't do anything to you. So he's saying, okay, you want to play hardball, I'm ready to play hardball. If you want to be nice, I'm ready to be nice. So I think this is a different cup of tea. I think your neighbors are figuring it out, at least that you can. The question is, for those who are good to you, are you willing to deliver? I think there we got to see. On Pakistan, of course, is a completely different game. I think that what started out under Manmohan Singh, a reasonable possibility for doing a big deal, didn't happen. Now, this guy started well, is offered a set of economic proposals to Nawaz Sharif, but Nawaz Sharif couldn't deliver. So he's saying, okay, I'm willing to take some risks. And I'm willing to test the army. And some of the arguments in Delhi is that, look, we're not fighting Nawaz Sharif, we're fighting the Pakistan army.
Yeah.
So what we're doing is to put pressure on the Pakistan army and not the Pakistani people. So, but of course, it's not easy to sell that argument in Pakistan. But the fact is, it is not, the story is not over. With Pakistan, as you know, it's more instinct and gut than a carefully calculated policy. What happens there, we're going to see. I think on the economic diplomacy, I think the institutional weakness is the primary one. I mean, not just it's across the board. That the foreign service is too small, you need to do something. That how do you create structures that are capable? I mean, how do you open the civil service? What do the Chinese call it? The iron rice bowl, right? One exam you pass, you made for life. Or sometimes even after death. I mean, that you have this complete protection from the state with no, I mean, every lizard becomes a T-Rex. The evolution of 30 years, 35 years, no foreign service lets everybody become an ambassador, but an Indian foreign service, you've got to be terrible to not to become an ambassador. You have to make some grave mistakes too. So I think this structure is not going to work. I think, but I think this is too complicated. I mean, I think the problem is not with IFS actually. The problem is with IAS. Can we change the system? There is some talk about reforming horizontal entry, lateral entry. Can we reopen the whole debates about reorganizing Indian bureaucracy? I think there have been some hints, but I would say, I mean, all this is still work that has to be done. But I would say Delhi is open for ideas. And I think the job for people like us is to say, look, can we put across a proposal? And say, look, this is what can be done. How do you reform the IAS? I mean, how do you expand? Because Indian bureaucracy, and I don't know if you've seen Milan Vaishnav's work, I mean, the problem has not been too much of bureaucracy, but just not enough of it. And what you have is in the wrong places. So the question, like, you're short of army officers, you're short of customs officers, you're short of revenue officers, you're short of administrators in the urban areas. So you need, India perhaps has the world's least number of policemen per 1,000 people. So I think you need a fundamental rethink of how you're going to think about your bureaucratic structures. There, I think, I would say, institutions like ours, I mean, I think we should push across and say, look, this is the situation, this is what we need to do. And then I think set off a debate. If some osmosis, something filters through to Delhi, I think that'll be great. I think on the nuclear deal, it's an interesting question. It's almost 10 years, we're still not there. I think the previous government dropped the ball. We should have wrapped it up when Bush was there. Instead, we looked at a gift horse in the mouth and started counting the teeth, and things started changing. And domestically, the backlash, the Congress party could not manage it. Sonia Gandhi was not interested in it. And so now you are stuck at a situation where actually you come this far, you're still struggling to finalize the last bits with the Americans, which means then the Japanese and Australia will also be tied to that. No, I think what they agreed in Washington was a threefold framework. I think they're going to start the dialogue next month. One, we had to finish the liability issue. That we made it impossible for anyone to invest in India's nuclear industry. Even Indian private sector doesn't want to touch the Department of Atomic Energy today because it's a stupid law, bad law that was passed, hustled into Parliament, and these guys, the Congress, couldn't stop it. So we have to find a way of changing that law or creating administrative workarounds that will convince the investors, both domestic and foreign, look, we can do business with the atomic energy industry in India. I think that's the first step. Second is the outstanding issues in terms of the so-called administrative arrangements, safeguards agreements. Some of those are still need to be done. I think we need to finish those there. I think the ball, some of it is in the American court. Third aspect is India's membership of the Nuclear Supplies Group. So I think there is an unstated linkage between these three, and that if you get this right in the next 6 months, you might see progress. Because I think Modi is quite clear that, look, you can't face the climate change pressures without doing nuclear. Because that's what Chinese are doing, essentially solar, nuclear. If you don't bring the other stuff in, you're not going to be able to deal with the energy mix. So I think once the secret is out, that look, no Indian private sector is touching the Department of Atomic Energy. Companies like Larsen & Toubro, Walchandnagar, who've been there from the beginning. Today, say, look, I mean, how can anybody put money into this if you make the supplier liable forever and for unlimited amounts? So I think that will be the first step, and if they can do that in some form, the other two can fall into place. So I think there was some understanding with Obama that we'll move this forward, we'll try and finish it in the next 1 year. Let's see what happens, but it's going to be, and an improved relationship with the US creates better conditions, as you're right. See, if Mr. Anthony was not interested in defense relationship, Mr. Commerce Minister was not interested in a trade deal, Mr. Finance Minister was not more interested in taxing every company in the US. So if we change that overall orientation and are ready to do business with the Americans, then I think solving the nuclear problem will become much easier.
Johnson, yes.
Yeah, my question relates to what Amitendu asked as well. Given that Modi has no experience in foreign policy, given that Modi has no previous established experience in effecting any form of policy, even BJP in its articulation of foreign policy, I think only made mention of economic diplomacy. Now that he's apparently doing quite well, to what extent is the contribution of, say, Jay Shankar in the United States, and Biren Nanda in Australia, and maybe Ajit Doval in the case of Sri Lanka and Pakistan, my assumption is that they are playing a very critical role in defining India's foreign policy, contrary to the perception that is being driven by Modi himself. What's your take on this?
Any insight on Modi's approach to South Korea and maybe plus North Korea?
Anybody?
You mentioned earlier in your lecture that there has been no mention of non-alignment under this current government, but if you look carefully at his actions since coming to power, he has tried to carefully balance his relations, India's relations with China, Japan, and the US, so that he does not be seen as going overly to any one side. So why is it significant that even though he has not made any mention of non-alignment, he has still, in his actions, continued with that policy?
Yeah, I think the personal issues are quite critical. I mean, I think finally they say personal is policy. That in large establishments, look in the US, who is the NSA makes a difference, who is the Secretary of State makes a difference, who is the defense secretary. So those things fundamentally matter, because when you have such a large system, no large system is going to operate on the basis of a general theory and a general guideline. So you need people who actually enforce discipline, in a sense, certain policy initiatives. Now, in this case, look, I think partly there is a feeling that, look, some of the early choices he has made were not smart. I mean, I don't know, Rahul will know the whole argument whether it was a wise move to get Nipin Mishra, whether it's actually effective. Then you get another Mishra to make it Mishra Square, call him something else. So I think, but the fact is, domestically, he's okay. He has some sense of his administrative experience, so he can deal with economic things. On the foreign policy, I think sometimes not having experience is also a good thing. So you not have any baggage. So to the extent that he can break the existing molds, which is done, I think, in the case of multilateralism, in the case of Nepal, in the case of US, I think he's willing to think afresh. Like his approach to diaspora, which is again has come from his own understanding of the world, because he spent a lot of time, good Jews are, world over, and he spent a lot of time when he was nobody. In the 90s, when he was in exile from BJP, he spent a lot of time in the US. I think he was telling Jaishankar, I believe, I traveled to every state in the US, because there are Gujaratis in every state in the US. Because he has an understanding of the world which is more practical without any kind of theoretical thing. But you still need good people to enforce it. My understanding of Indian bureaucracy, how it works, look, if you have a smart joint secretary, you can run with the ball. I mean, you can actually create space for yourself. So those who take the initiative, those ambassadors who want to say, look, I'm willing to push a new line. I think he's open, and his problem is that the system is not responding to his ideas. So we might find one Jaishankar or somebody else, but the real challenge is going to be how do you produce that final outcome. I think his foreign policy team is quite thin. Everybody's not a secret that, look, he doesn't much care for the foreign minister. He doesn't much care for the foreign office because he thinks those guys are living in the... He keeps using this term, they're in the 20th century. But he wants to be in the 21st century, pushing new ideas. But the system is so stuck in its old... And so for that, it can only be broken by a few decisive figures. So there is a lot of speculation whether he's going to change this foreign policy team, whether he's going to bring Jaishankar back or those kind of ideas. But we have not seen anything. But it is still possible that there will be significant changes somewhere down the line. Because so far he's operated on instinct, and you can't do this on instinct. It's too many issues at play and too many interconnections. So at some point he needs a system and an overall directive which kind of lets the foreign policy move. And South Korea, North Korea, I think the policy was already beginning to change in the previous government. Earlier, Delhi used to sing strict equality between North Korea and South Korea, which I thought was stupid. But nevertheless, it started changing in the last 10 years, where you saw in relation to some of the recent incidents in the conflict between North and South. In fact, India was more critical of the North. But they've also recognized, look, while our relationship with South Korea has expanded, we must also keep a channel open to the North. So I think which is actually, nobody had gone there for years. Recently, our Joint Secretary dealing with China went there. So I think our interest in the long term, look, India's interest lies in a strong Korean peninsula. Since they're not Chinese or Japanese, it's a great idea to have a strong Korea that can actually play an independent role and deal with the world. So it's going to be a natural partner for us, but I think we need to pay more attention, because part of the problem is also South Korea is too inward looking. It's more focused on the peninsula. It's only in the last 2 years they're talking about a global Korea, engage the world, doing interesting things. So I think there is huge room for, and I think Modi senses there's money, investment possible. I'm sure he'll go all out to get the South Korean business into India. They already have a big presence. I think on the non-alignment thing, I think it is about engaging everyone is not non-alignment. That the essence of the policy is that, look, it is a multi-directional engagement today. After the Cold War, what you had was, look, you had a chance to engage everyone because there was no conflict among the major powers. Okay, we have a bit of a problem now between the Americans and the Russians and the Americans and the Chinese now. But essentially the post-Cold War environment offered you an opportunity to engage everyone without having to worry about the consequences, about what others might think. So that gave you the room to engage everyone, benefit from everyone, investments, economics, strategic, etc. But I think what the UPA government did was to limit the engagement with the United States for the fear of offending China. Limit your relationship with Vietnam and Japan, because Chinese will get upset. So this was the return to so-called non-alignment or anti-Western policies as the benchmark, which was the problem with the previous government. And this government has simply gone back to one of saying, I'm ready to engage everyone. And look, I can't do too much defense cooperation with the Chinese, after all, there are good reasons for that. But to stop defense cooperation with the Americans saying Chinese will get upset if I do exercise with the... That was the problem with the UPA government. Mr. Antony was a master of masterly inactivity or negative activity, that he wrecked what was started by Pranab Mukherjee into fundamentally a fearful, self-denying strategy which was disastrous. What we've seen happen in the last 6 months is to change that. Look, we're not going to be afraid. The Chinese don't ask our permission to do some cooperation with the Pakistanis. They don't ask our permission to do something. Even Xi Jinping goes to Colombo and says, look, we're going to have defense cooperation with Sri Lanka, and we won't let anybody interfere in the internal affairs of Sri Lanka, because you know what he was saying. Now, why should India say, look, I won't do things with the US because China will get upset? But that was an intellectual, mental problem that the UPA government had. He's merely breaking out of that and saying, look, I'm willing to do business with whoever is willing to do business with me. More defense with the Americans, more defense with Japan. The president says, look, I'll sell the BrahMos missile to the Vietnamese. Which is exactly what Chinese are doing to our neighbors, right? So it's not rocket science. That's where I think the damage that the UPA government did If you understand that, I think, so this is, and these guys are not committed to, Narasimha Rao didn't talk too much about non-alignment. Vajpayee didn't at all. But then the UPA comes back and says 2.0, we got to be careful, third worldism, socialism. It is the resurrection of the forgotten nonsense, I mean, you want to call it, which is what the UPA government did. So I think reversing that is the key, and I think that's where we are at this point.
Any other questions?
I just want to make some remarks. You're talking about Mr. Modi riding over the RSS. Now, last week we had an idiot minister from India who spoke in the Perumal temple.
Which one is
You remember Naidu? Were you there? Saying that Muslims, outsiders, they have come from outside, they have to behave themselves. And
this was not reported in
sort of second-class citizens and all that. Anyway, I kicked the organizer as part of the organization. So you have these kinds of idiots there with ministerial position, and I think it's about time Modi put a stop to that sort of talk, because that creates more problems for him than for anybody else. Number two is the right thing that's happening in India is the Make in India policy. Now, if he makes that easy, everybody of his neighbors will make money, because it's a giant project. It will need small manufacturers in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in all these places come in to reap the benefit of giving, because they are cheap too. India is cheap, Pakistan is even cheaper, Bangladesh is even cheaper. So a lot of things will flow to the neighboring countries. The third is just to report incident that I had. I was sitting next to Modi I went to his speech in one of the PVD meetings 2 years ago, and I asked him two questions. One, in India, is Hinduism in danger? Number two, here's my book on SAARC and cooperation between the SAARC countries, which I assess as Jews, which I've written. And I was very delighted when the first thing he did was to invite all his neighbors, But it is also, the neighbors also have a responsibility to respond, particularly Pakistan, which is a failed state and which depends on loans on foreign fighters, but that has ended. So now what do you do? And I think opening the doors of trade between India and Pakistan would solve this problem to a very, very large extent. And I think that what Modi has done on this one, Make in India, is a big thing. And if it's pushed to its logical level, it will reach the things that happened in China itself. China's now was just opening up its economy and becoming a giant economic country. Everybody is interested in dealing with China. So I think that's it.
Thank you, Mr.
What your
Jawad.
views on that?
Thank you. Anybody else? Can I use the prerogative of that? Sorry, did anyone? Question? No. So one.
You wanted
what? Okay, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Vasco, and I work for a testing company. Now, lately, there was a deeper military tie announcement with China, Singapore and China. Right?
Singapore and China.
Singapore and China. Right? Now, as a former national security advisor, maybe you can have some comments on this.
Maybe Raja, I jump on the bandwagon. Afghanistan. It is not totally Modi's, I guess, fault, but I guess what he inherited from before. There is a sense that India has lost its moment in Afghanistan. They backed the wrong guy. They backed Abdullah, and won or lost or whatever. He's not number one man, and therefore Pakistan is very happy they've managed to fill the gap that India had that moment with Hamid Karzai, and they basically dropped it. Number two, Mr. Jimaboy also said, and you also said that, if only you can improve economic cooperation with Pakistan, all is okay. I beg to differ. I think it's bigger than that. I think it's a problem. I think no Indian Prime Minister has real proper options when it comes to Pakistan. The options are highly limited. It's just making sure things don't get out of hand. So I think anything that with Pakistan is just damage control. One other thing, what you thought about that? Thanks.
I think the only question of, look, as I said, clearly, look, this is not the Congress party in a sense. Look, one woman and a son can set the company line. So he's now trying to engineer a transformation in a party that has come from a very nativist, inward-looking, xenophobic origin and organized along complicated lines into a modern party. So this is a huge challenge. So his own colleagues, people, Naidu or Rajnath Singh or Sushma Swaraj, they come from backgrounds which instinctively you see them completely opposite to what he wants. Even take Nirmala Sitharaman, a relatively young JNU product, CSP, economics, SSS, PhD. There she is, hammering away at, in multilateral forums on the trade issue. Well, this guy says, look, cut it deep. In fact, he was saying that, look, I think, in fact, he met a few of us recently, just 2 weeks ago. He says, Obama held his hand and said, look, I also give food subsidy. So look, so let's find a way out. So he promised, look, I'll explore a deal. Now, you can cut deals. So the problem is, how do you get this complicated party that he's not the king? He might have, he's trying to become the king, but it's still the too many forces in the party. So that is going to be a big challenge, because for him, I think he's told people that, look, I've not come here to do Hindi prachar or promote Hindi or Hindutva, that I've come here to be PM for 10 years at least. That is his ambition. Now, the problem is, how does he manage that? On the economic side, look, I think his only way is to keep doing the economic thing with the neighbors. Again, I think he told the small group we met him, he says, look, I have a good relations, I have good contacts with all the businessmen in Karachi. He said, they've been begging me to come to Karachi. All the same Gujarat, the Kachis, the Marwadis, the Kachis, the Boras, the full range of them, Memons. They're all from the corner of the world, which is one of the oldest trading civilizations. Starting from Gujarat all the way to Kutch, that arc is probably one of the most globalized. And the guys have business. They can make money even before you sit Jack Robinson. So that capability, and he says, look, they've been asking him, look, can we do things together? Can we work together? Then I think the problem is he's trapped in a bigger issue, and I think that's where can he transcend that and construct an economic framework in which you can. I think one interesting thing you noticed, if you see the visuals of both the Madison Square Garden and the Sydney, I don't know if it is conscious, there was a special outreach to the Muslims of Pakistan, the business types. Again, the Gujus from the other side, that essentially you saw them sitting there and saying that, look, we want to do business with India. So I think there is room, but the question is, how do you navigate that is going to be very, very important. The third thing, I think, interesting thing, he said, look, all people of Indian origin will get lifelong visa. No, that doesn't apply only to the Hindus. So this is going to be, if they actually implement, you're talking about a fundamental, of course, it won't apply to Pakistanis and Bangladeshis because that's going to be the exception because of the partition issue. But anyone outside the subcontinent, I think you're talking about a very interesting move where my view is, in fact, I've said this, I hope the ISAS kind of, seduces Modi into coming and going to the next diaspora meeting, because for him, diaspora is very, very important. And if there's a way he can reach to the South Asian diaspora as a whole and get them to invest in India, because after all, the Pakistani doctors, the Bangladeshi doctors do as well in the US, they're everywhere, they're as talented as the Indians are. So get them to invest in, if Pakistan can't use them, and why shouldn't we use them? So I think there is if you put economic as the priority, there are ways in which I think he can reach out to a larger community and use that actually, if you get the Punjabis on both sides. Say, look, I mean, is there a different way of doing business across Wagah? Of course, the army will still have to we'll have to contend with them. So I think there are interesting possibilities. But how much space does he have to follow this is what we don't know. So on Singapore, China, I think that, look, I'm not worried about, I mean, I'm not anyway, I was never a national security advisor. I was only in a board, which is a bunch of outsiders. I mean, they're not part of the government. Look, I think Singapore is on the way to the Indian Ocean. Right? Whatever the Chinese do, just as Indians see Singapore as the access to South China Sea and the Pacific, for Chinese, this is the access to Indian Ocean. It's on the way, you can't but stop. And Singapore's historic maritime significance was it was at the junction of the two great oceans. Now that significance is not going to disappear. So the Chinese have been knocking at the doors ever since India signed an agreement in 2003. Chinese is saying, look, why can't you have the same agreement with us? You let the Indian ships come into Singapore, Changi. American ships are docking here all the time. So why don't you let the Chinese? They said, okay, Singapore will say yes. You can't say no. I mean, you can't say, no, I won't let your ships park in Changi. But there is also a constraint. Look, all Singapore's equipment is American. It's not going to let the Chinese walk all over the place so that Americans say, look, what the hell is going on here? So there are limits, but nobody is going to say no to China. If you want to have a defense agreement, if you want the ships to come, but there are also going to be limits of how far you're going to go. I mean, take Oman, for example, one of the best friends of India. The Chinese ships have been calling at Salalah now since the 2008 Gulf operations. They're there every other day. So I think as the Chinese are a rising power, they're going to have access all around the world. But then people have to calculate the consequence. India is not the issue for Singapore.
It's the US.
For Singapore, it's the question of US is the issue. So like everyone, I mean, Singapore being small, it has to navigate even more carefully between US and China. So at this point, there's no comparison between Singapore's relationship with the US and its engagement with China. So I'm not really worried about it. I think the last point is about Afghanistan. Look, Afghanistan, I think the Indian role was always overstated. I mean, it was nice when the Americans come and tell us you are in rivalry with Pakistan. I said, it's ridiculous because I say, look, how can I be in rivalry with a country which has 2,500 kilometers of open border with Afghanistan? To the projection of somehow India and Pakistan are equal in Afghanistan is completely, doesn't stand scrutiny even for 1 minute because geography gives Pakistan unique access. India has no physical boundary with Afghanistan, which also works, which is also our advantage and disadvantage. For Pakistan, the open border and the shared Pashtun frontier is an advantage because it can run all the intelligence operations, but it's also its biggest weakness. For India, because we don't have a border, the Afghans love us. We can't do any mischief out there. But because we don't have a border, what we can do is also limited. So that geopolitical reality is not going to change by regime change within. So I think Pakistan will always be number one power in Afghanistan. What does it mean? Look, if Pakistan overplays its hands, then there'll always be somebody wanting to fight the present government. So the story is not over. The great game never finishes, as Rudyard Kipling said. It's only one more terrible chapter that's going to start, which is if Pakistan has its way in Afghanistan, it's going to crack up Afghanistan. That is, if you have a Pashtun-dominated, Taliban-oriented government in Kabul, the Northern Alliance, the ethnics are not going to like it. So how does Pakistan construct that balance internally? Assuming that, they had a free hand, right? Yeah. Between 89 to 2001, we were not there. Nobody was there. They had a free hand. What did they do with it? Zero. So, I mean, the problem with Pakistan is, look, overreach. So India can just wait. I mean, I don't think we should say, look, Americans are leaving, therefore India should rush into Afghanistan and stand up. Just wait. I mean, sometimes masterly inactivity is a good policy. So you step back, see how things unfold and see. So I think we can fully wait. I think on Pakistan, the last point, it is going to be a test. I mean, I think there are going to be, as the economic thing, for example, Modi has given them an economic roadmap. So did Manmohan Singh. They're not willing to do even simple things. Not because Nawaz Sharif doesn't want to do it. The good Punjabi wants to open up the Wagah border. But the problem is, The army says no. So I think by the struggle for India and Pakistan is, look, how do you stop treating it as a black box? Conscious of army's overweening dominant role, but yet reach out to different groups within Pakistan who have a stake in improved relationship with India. But we are nowhere near getting there at this point.
Thank you, Raja. I think we could probably go on for another hour, but we're supposed to finish at 12. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Raja. As a token of ISAS appreciation, very, very small token, but not very small, because this is a book by our colleague Rajesh Rai, Indians in Singapore. They're talking about diaspora in the colonial port city. So thank you, Raja.